introducing our first presenter, and that is Dr. Roger Faust with the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. Dr. Faust is a postdoctoral fellow in environmental studies at Carleton College, whose work really focuses on natural resource management and collaborative approaches with tribal communities. He helps build partnerships among tribal communities, conservation agencies, and academic institutions to ensure tribal perspectives inform environmental decision making, with an emphasis on community well-being, engagement, and indigenous sovereignty. During his PhD at the University of Minnesota, he worked with tribal partners to co-develop CWD management strategies and outreach materials aligned with their priorities and expertise. And his work really focuses on strengthening long-term relationships and advancing conservation practices grounded in Indigenous-led stewardship. So with that, again, I'm happy to introduce you to Dr. Faust, who will start out, and again, excited to host another webinar. So thank you again for joining, and we'll get started. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That's a wonderful introduction. Again, I just want to say I'm Roger Faust. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in environmental studies at Carleton College. I'm fortunate that this transitions into an assistant professor position in the fall here. I'm an enrolled member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. That's a Ho-Chunk tribe for reference. But today I'm going to talk about some of the work I did during my PhD. I'm going to share an overview of a couple different chapters there, including the process we engage tribes in to further CWD outreach and management with their communities. And I want to start off with thanking my key collaborators. Without them, their time, their patience, and trust in me, frankly, none of this work would have been possible. So big thank you to them. Now, I'm not going to go through the biology of chronic wasting disease, but I think it's important to put the context of tribes in conjunction with this chronic wasting disease problem to the forefront. So I apologize, this map's a bit outdated. Of course, we see Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The counties in yellow have had at least one CWD detection, and I understand there have been a few more since this map has been created. In the orange and black, you see American Indian reservations, and the gray overlay are treaty-ceded territories. To give you an idea of how this problem is growing, when I started my PhD in roughly 2020, there were only about 12 or so counties highlighted on this map in Minnesota, and by the time I finished, that number was over 20, and that's still growing. So you might imagine many tribal communities are living near CWD for the first time. At least in the time of my PhD, it was not yet detected on a reservation in Minnesota, but there was a growing urgency from the tribes to prepare for it, including their management agencies and their community members. But I don't want anyone in here in this audience to forget that these treaty-ceded territories, tribal members, they retain the rights to hunt, fish, and gather. And so issues of chronic wasting disease expand to off of reservation lands. So I want to dive into a couple chapters. My first chapter, we work towards improving chronic wasting disease outreach for tribal communities. We had some insider information that some of the DNR's outreach wasn't necessarily resonating or maybe even reaching some of the tribal communities. And so we wanted to understand how the disease might uniquely be impacting tribes and use that information to develop better outreach. And through doing that, we wanted to empower community members to improve that research process as well as the outcomes because they know their community best. So in doing that, we used a community-based participatory research approach, often abbreviated CBPR, and I define this as research that is co-created between community members and professional scientists, where power is shared between both parties in all aspects of the research process. And typically in these studies, the outcomes tend to benefit the community via interventions and policy change. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see a figure that my then advisor, Tiffany Wolf, created in 2021 that held true throughout the project. We engaged with tribal partners from the very beginning, determining what the study design would be needed, what the tribes wanted, what kind of information they were looking for. And we determined that an interview project would be the best way to go about doing that, which our tribal partners then led. They were invited to take part in the analysis of this qualitative data analysis process. However, they have other roles in the community. They have jobs. And so they declined to take part in this process, but wanted us to come back with this information and the findings to ensure that we're on the same page with how we're interpreting and understanding and ultimately going to use this information through outreach and reporting. So I mentioned this is an interview process, and again, our tribal partners led the interviews. These tribal partners that were working with us were identified through the tribal natural resource agencies that we had connections with. And in these processes, the partners then went into their communities and identified people to interview, including a wide mix of genders, ages, and even levels of hunting participation. But something that was common amongst all of the interviewees was that they were respected community members who could speak to the values of the community. So across the four partnering tribes, there were 25 interviews completed, typically about 20-minute long interviews. Some were as short as 10 minutes, some went close to an hour. Regardless, our community partners interviewed more and more participants in their community until they felt they hit the point of saturation, meaning that they were no longer hearing new information coming from subsequent interviews. So this was a semi-structured interview process. There was an interview guide, but our partners were free to ask their own questions that met their priorities, and they played a big role in developing the actual interview guide as well. So the question list was roughly a dozen questions, but just to give you a sample of what those look like, question number 3 was, are you worried about chronic wasting disease? Why or why not? And question number 6 was natural resource managers want to get information out to hunters about chronic wasting disease. How could they do this better? And you might imagine that these two questions are working in conjunction to build better outreach materials. Following this process, I mentioned that the University of Minnesota team, that was me, led the coding process through the qualitative data analysis process. And this led to thematic analysis, where ultimately from these interviews, we were trying to highlight ubiquitous and frequent aspects of the conversations to pull out commonalities and greater sentiments and information that was being conveyed across the variety of interviews to tell a more cohesive story as to what was going on. And one of those themes that came out of that process was concerns about health. So, to be more specific, there's a concern that CWD will negatively impact the local deer herd's health, but that then raises concerns about human health. And as an example of a quote in this theme, I share from respondent number 1, they said, I'm worried. I think you want to make sure that whatever it is that's affecting the deer, that we understand as much as we can about it and make sure that obviously it doesn't make humans sick by eating them. But yeah, the more I think we know, if they have a problem, you want to see the species flourish, not have issues. A related theme, concerns about food and how CWD could negatively impact an important food source to many communities. When respondent number 4 was asked about the potential impact of CWD in a herd where their family hunts, respondent number 4 said, one thing is that it is a huge, significant food source for a lot of people. My immediate family, it's a significant food source for them. The other thing is that living in this community is that we are absolutely considered an extreme food desert, so to speak. Therefore, access to fresh foods, including meats, lean meats, are better for our health. Lean wild meats. So it would have an impact on human health. It would have a financial impact. Likewise, we heard concerns about culture, traditions, and ceremonies when respondent number 6 was given the hypothetical of the nearby herd having chronic wasting disease. They shared, I think that would affect us hugely. Being such an integral part of our life, we're born hunters. So from the time my grandsons watch me hang a deer, they've always said, I want to do that. So it's a learning process for young people about hunting and respecting an animal that you're going to shoot and giving thanks for it, giving you, feeding you. That's part of our teachings and traditions is you give thanks for the animal that has provided you some food. I think it would change a lot. And you might recall that question 6 I shared earlier, and we, from that question, got a variety of information sources where people were currently hearing about chronic wasting disease in these communities. But then they also shared where they wanted to hear more from, sources that were desired, trustworthy, but perhaps could be more accessible. And so on the right here, you can see that includes newspaper articles and handouts, a more accessible DNR website and app, and in-person forums. It would mean a lot to these communities if natural resource agencies made the efforts to go to their communities, build understanding, and show that they care about these communities' values and needs too. But I want to highlight that this process was much larger than just a few of those themes. And this community engaged process allowed us to capture so many different perspectives and dive so much deeper into any of these interviews than if I were leading this, because I don't have these community contexts and values. And I think that's part of the beauty of this community-based participatory research approach. So there's a lot going on here, and this was all greatly informative, but I want to highlight a few of these that were helpful in particular in thinking about outreach development. And that includes those preferred information sources I just shared, but also the value of deer and hunting, the knowledge in the community about chronic wasting disease, as well as perhaps misconceptions to address, and uncertainties and concerns, as well as questions that the community has. So I want to say this is a very early rough draft in the process, but we were able to build an outreach document that addressed each community's specific questions and concerns, incorporated values and languages from those communities, and we were working towards building or adding a collection of more imagery that's culturally relevant and informative so that this was more accessible to a broad audience. So stepping back to the process, I mentioned after the analysis, we went to the community for their feedback on the interpretation of our findings, but we also shared this rough draft handout and we thought about and strategized how we can move forward with this information. And in this meeting, our community partners, they reinforced our findings, but they added some new perspectives, including conflicts between CWD testing times and ceremonial practices. It's just a big problem for them. But they also shared that there's a growing urgency as chronic wasting disease was continuing to spread, and as at that time there were new detections near Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake, there was a growing urgency for these tribes to build a response plan to address those community needs. And it should be noted, though, there's a DNR plan, a Minnesota state plan, but it doesn't necessarily address their cultural values and needs, could potentially be in conflict with community practices, and might not work for those communities and other contexts, amongst other things. So I went on to work with the tribes on that aspect. But something neat I want to point out on the right side of this image, at this convening, we had a graphic recorder named Rebecca Anderson who live illustrated the conversation. And this was a nice way to not record, to show respect in that we were listening to the conversation. They could see that we were listening, they could see how we were interpreting the conversation. And this ultimately produced a document that they could bring back to their communities. We were able to print this into many copies as well as distribute digitally. So that is blown up on this slide here, which I want to leave up for about 20 seconds for you all to take a look at. It's pretty neat. Okay, I wish I could keep this up forever. It's beautiful. There's a lot going on here. I'm happy to chat about it more if there's that option in the Q&A. But I also want to highlight that there's much more to this project than what I'm able to share in this time. And so the work that we did along these lines, we were able to co-author with our tribal partners, and this was published in December of last year. But I really quickly, with the time I have left, I just want to share what happened next. And so, again, we heard that urgency for chronic wasting disease management plans or response plans. And so we worked with those same partners in addition to others to meet those tribes' unique needs. And again, we wanted to get community engagement to understand the nuances and needs of those communities. And ultimately, we hope to create a template for other tribes to follow in CWD management. So initially, we worked with White Earth, Red Lake, and the Leech Lake Nation to build these plans. And then eventually the Keweenaw Bay community, they saw the work that we were doing and they thought that was a neat process. So we ended up working with them as well. And I have limited time, so I don't have the time to explain this whole process. But essentially, we started out with community organ or with brainstorming sessions amongst the tribal natural resource managers to envision a preferred goal or future to come out of these management plans, and then breaking it down to think through all of the different components we need to address to make that happen. And this was a fantastic time for these natural resource managers to be in conversation with each other, to strategize with each other, but also to think through all the different challenges they have and think through the questions they might need to ask the community to better understand what the appropriate approach could be. And so after that process, that's exactly what we did. We went back to each of these communities, held publicly open meetings, as well as targeted outreach meetings to understand how community members are seeing these different challenges and solutions in possible CWD management strategies. And while I don't have the time to dive deep into each of these, some of the broader conversations surrounded the topic of surveillance, including some of those barriers to testing, such as those testing time conflicts I mentioned earlier. We discussed the challenges of mandatory testing, but instead, tribes might be intrinsically motivated to get involved. And we also talked about DNR collaboration, how that would be very acceptable and very welcomed in these communities if the DNR was respectful and listening. We talked about some other response topics, carcass movement restrictions, deer attractant or feeding bans are quite common in management plans. We talked through the challenges those might present to communities or whether they would be supported or not, as well as deer density reductions. And something I want to point out though is that I present these like themes, but each community, they have different thoughts and values on each of these. And so something I do want to highlight about this process, I think a lot of tribes come to us and they say, "Oh, do you have this plan as an example?" And that can be a good starting point, but really the process that we went through is what is valuable because each community has their own values and contexts, needs, and capacities. So that process is something that I want to emphasize first. And engaging the community can help us understand those specific contexts. And with that, I just want to thank the various funding sources I had, including the LCCMR, MinPro, the University of Minnesota, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. And of course, yet again, all of our tribal partners. Without them, this work wouldn't have been possible. And it was such a joy. So thank you all.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger, for kicking that off. That was great. Really appreciate it. And just as a reminder to folks, we will save the questions till after all three presentations are over. So um, I'll just pass the baton here and introduce our next speaker, and Thomas Seiler. He is a communications and outreach strategist for the Minnesota Center for Prion Research and Outreach, or again, MinPro. He holds a master's in English from the University of Montana, where his use of video game engines and pedagogy was recognized with an Excellence in Teaching Award. And outside academia, he ran a multimedia company focused on community and nonprofits. So, with that, I'm excited again to hear from Tom. The floor is yours.
Great. Hi, friends and colleagues. Thank you very much, Cory. I'm going to be presenting on cofactor, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can see my slides. Cofactor is a game being developed by the Minnesota Center for Prion Research and Outreach. The core team includes Mark Schwabelander and Tanya Seiler. And I wanted to actually think a bit about how this came to be and talk about the game's philosophy, because I think you'll find it interesting. It goes back actually to the idea of biostatements, believe it or not. Biostatements like the ones that we use to introduce speakers, in fact, because they can hold a strange power. Early on in my academic career, I read such a statement that sort of redirected my scholarly life. Almost offhandedly, a professor of mine described his subjects of study as religious liturgy and other forms of human play.
Tom, sorry to cut you off here. Apologies. I think we are seeing the presenter mode or the reverse. We can see we can see the presenter mode. So I don't know if you can switch it. Apologies for interrupting you here, but
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for the interruption. So, going to Try again. Is this
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
great?
Sorry again.
Okay. All right. So, like the game cofactor, maybe this will require a few iterations to get right. So, thanks for setting that straight. So I didn't know what to do with this idea of play that I hadn't encountered before. I had been to religious services, and I found that the idea that play was taking place there a pretty hard sell. Joysticks, dice, beach balls. These were conspicuously absent on the days that I attended. But his point wasn't to characterize religious worship as frivolous, but to say this is an activity like play because it doesn't aim to produce anything material. It takes place in a space that is set apart with its own rules and in which we engage with symbols. The expansion of the term play to include serious things like sacred rites led me to appreciate the pervasiveness of play in culture. Play can have serious utility in understanding the ways we communicate and persuade one another and even influence beliefs. As an educator, as you heard, I use video game engines in my teaching. And in doing that, I discovered how they could be particularly apt at dealing with thorny subjects. So, what is the problem that we're hoping to address? CWD management depends on an engaged public to know where the disease is and to take part in strategies to mitigate it. Our center has thousands of conversations with people annually, and then we'll survey them. The surveys have shown that almost 40% of them are learning about prion basics for the very first time from that conversation. If you put yourself in the shoes of someone who is freshly exposed to those basics, you'll know and you'll recall that CWD is characterized by a runaway accumulation of misfolded proteins. It's incurable. And in a way, it resembles Alzheimer's, but accelerated, bringing death in about 2 years. Now reflect that it is contagious, that it involves an atypical pathogen, and once shed onto the landscape could be found there, still in its infectious form, 15 years later. So when a disease is terrifying, when it's not intuitive to the public, and yet it requires a multi-generational response from the public, then you will have some serious messaging barriers to overcome. This is where I believe play can help us. I'm going to share with you a screen from Cofactor. Now, this is just a screenshot. You're dropped into the game without a lot of preparation about CWD, but you're enjoying a weekend hunt with your friend Jace, sitting in a tree stand. There's mild weather and a cardinal singing. And at the bottom of the screen, you're given options after a buck appears. These options, extremely simple. But if I give you an overview of the game's features, what's special about the game may emerge. The player's motivations and actions will shape the story as it progresses. You start out as a hunter and you unlock other roles as you go. The game's assets change according to the hunting location that you've chosen. It's built on standard web languages, and so its modular design will allow for that adaptation. The visuals are going to change, the sounds are going to change in the environment, but also, importantly, the regulations particular to that area, and even the prevalence of CWD there. That is obvious then a setup for some building real world skill. By immersing players in real world scenarios and producing tasks one might encounter in actual lab experiments, we might be training the next generation of CWD management. I mean, if you could play Tetris in order to improve your spatial reasoning, and that helps surgeons, and as I've seen, Animal Crossing can help species identification, then why not? But if you follow the recent scholarly interest in educational video games, you'll know that applying badges and scoreboards isn't enough. You may have heard the term gamification, and much of that is going to rely on stirring a competitive instinct within a class, so that's going to raise interest levels. But research shows that this can be counterproductive to learning. The focus of this talk is the hunch that the most powerful thing we're offering in Cofactor, and the thing on which learning objectives will depend, is a sense of play. Instead of earning points, we want to inspire a dissociation for our players' day-to-day identities where we've built the strongest defenses against new information because that might threaten a sense of who we are. In fact, a goal of the game is to play in a revolving series of roles, each with different resources or powers at their disposal, but all of them able to explore scientifically and contribute to progress on CWD. To me, the idea of a CWD themed role playing game is actually a natural development. The same engine that drives science drives successful public outreach and fuels good video games, and that is curiosity. And to fail to respect these in these endeavors, failing to respect curiosity is fatal. So Cofactor seeks to reward it. This engages many moods, but I'm going to highlight the, I'll say, responsibly irreverent aspects that we engage in the game. So going back to it, you have this decision to make. And we're going to go ahead and go with the class clowns and choose to sing to the deer. With head raised to the empty tree canopy, your lungs chill as you draw an enormous breath and begin belting Walk the Moon's 2014 hit and karaoke mainstay, Shut Up and Dance with passionate feeling. Your hunting companion looks at you with a furious expression. The deer does not respond. Now, if any of you have hunted previously, then you'll acknowledge this is an uncommon scenario. It's about as likely as the convent food fight that I had showed you earlier, but it does prompt all sorts of questions. Questions like how many songs are in the game? And what happens if I sing a more contemporary top 40 hit to a deer? These are questions that the students that we've introduced the game to have asked this. But each of the questions on the previous screen rewards curiosity by revealing a quirky and fascinating aspect and issue surrounding CWD. Why are we going so far into this responsibly irreverent mode? Why play? We'll remind ourselves of the barriers that we face. One being fear. As CWD continues to come to new counties, states, and provinces in North America, the consequences are truly frightening. Fear would short circuit our reasoning, leading to disengagement. I remember talking to a hunter at a trade show who expressed the opinion, I hope that CWD becomes endemic everywhere. Then we can stop worrying about it. I reviewed message boards and social media posts and found a similar mood of confusion and fatalism pervading the discussions online. So I think even a gaming skeptic can admit that a game will frame information in a less daunting light, and it shrinks issues to a more manageable size. The very fact that you are playing a game suggests that your actions could affect the outcome, which is the critical message. Same thing with complexity. It almost goes without saying that a game will allow for simplification of a topic. Yet we retain the particulars in Cofactor by adapting content to the player's location. It's difficult to make a tiny pathogen whose effects operate on a large time scale visible, but this game provides a sandbox where decisions have clear ecological impact. Meanwhile, players can still appreciate the complexity of issues by seeing them through perspectives of different roles. There's even greater complexity, though. To illustrate how Cofactor circumvents barriers against new information, I'll share another anecdote. So we've tested the game with different cross-sections of student populations. When we debuted the game to a group of overachiever types last spring, they saw that the narrative was headed toward a feast and that they, as hunters, would be serving this to their neighbors. They immediately sensed an opportunity. Wait, one of them said. Let's go back and make sure our knife is contaminated. I had the idea that this meant we had a success on our hands. Disentanglement of the proceedings from real life values was a sure sign that we were engaged in play. Because look, cultural traditions, food sovereignty, modes of survival are all under threat due to CWD. And in these circumstances, we are likely to respond rebelliously, to resist being told what to do, and to look for ways to demonstrate our free choice and agency. This is perfect fuel for the game. So recall the deer that we sang to earlier. Singing to a deer will yield one of three results in the game. The deer can run away, which is healthy behavior, but it is inconclusive. The deer will approach you if the deer is in early stages, or the deer goes on to not react in any way if it's in the late stages. Say all you wanted to do was to sing to each and every deer in the game over and over. That's actually a valid way to play and learn. It's weird, but it's valid. Because their response is tied to their CWD status, you could establish a prevalence rate by tracking the outcomes, harvesting the animals, and submitting their tissues for testing in the reference method within the game. In other words, you would be validating singing as a novel diagnostic for CWD. This bears further breakdown because it reveals a key to overcoming barriers against science communication. In playing cofactor, scientific information is accepted as provisionally true for the sake of the game. I'll play along to see what happens. The player then pokes around the game world, investigating the impact of parameter changes on the story. Actions generate data points, which, because of the cyclical nature of the game, provide an intrinsic test of repeatability. Players are invited then to rehearse the scientific method before learning about the regulations that might prompt anti-authority defenses. The game is deliberately absurd, triggering what-if curiosity. This strategy has the perfect subject in prion biology since it is so bizarre. I think we'll succeed if practicing weird science in a play context awakens a sense of possibility that can transfer to real life. So CWD was first detected in a wild deer in Minnesota about the time today's high school students were born. Evidence shows that prions being shed today will still be in the environment when the same students are in their 30s. That brings us to the final barrier, which is that it requires a multi-generational response. We can't depend on the aging population of committed hunters to solve CWD. We need everyone in on this effort. Cofactor is now entering a beta testing phase. The response from a few hundred high school students to play the game thus far has been tremendous. 25 teachers across the state of Minnesota are currently piloting Cofactor. Their collective feedback and guidance from an expert panel will inform game development. And this is going to be an iterative process. High school classrooms clamored for a resource like this. With the promise of engagement from young persons, you can appreciate the opportunity here to recruit helpers to the cause. Positive portrayals of natural resource managers, along with a taste of the interesting problems that they might face, highlight a previously unknown career path. And students who hadn't considered that they might before want to hunt might now express a curiosity. This help is needed. So Cofactor is going to reach adults through the University Extension Program, and we have hopes of introducing it into hunter education courses. Happily, the average age of a gamer is 36. Half are older. We think that Cofactor can appeal to adults as well, but we hunt half as much as we once did, and hunters are, as I was mentioning, typically older, typically white males. We think that adult editions of Cofactor can appeal to and recruit a diversity of players. Women are a cofactor, or women are a target of attracting to hunting and conservation. And so it's encouraging that a role-playing game like Cofactor stands to appeal to them. Surveys indicate that women consistently rank RPGs among their preferred game genres. To understand the broader appeal of what we're attempting with Cofactor, I want to just take a moment to look at a completely different game entirely, Red Dead Redemption 2. It's not designed as an educational tool, but it can serve as a case study for how immersive simulation impacts players. Research into this title revealed that players learn simply by interacting with the environment. First, tests showed that species identification increased among players, and secondly, perhaps more importantly, they reported finding wildlife observations in the game unexpectedly moving. The narrative identification was so high that it inspired affective connections. One person in the study said that they were inspired to pick up wildlife photography. And I even last week saw a YouTuber that decided that he was going to chase all the birds in the game to find out where they end up, simply because the game sparked this curiosity. So this leads us to the critical takeaway that even when a game's primary goal is entertainment, its realistic or immersive simulation of ecosystems can produce genuine ecological knowledge, foster affective connections to nature, and potentially inspire real-world conservation behaviors. So imagine if it was entertaining and also included so much real-world information. Imagine if we were able to fund a fully realized edition of our game. The game would be filled with the information that players could interact with and juxtapose in new ways. I think such a game would be more than the sum of its parts. So, for example, the game is going to represent prevalence data. A map that correlates prevalence to geographic features like waterways or the slope of land on some terrain. It doesn't really exist in the real world in an accessible way for the public. Could the players discover it? Maybe it would be possible that the way that the game extracts or abstracts data would allow new patterns to emerge, patterns that the players could notice and see correlations researchers haven't yet uncovered. Maybe a player would notice a more efficient way to run an experiment given the tools that we're providing in the game. So I'm dreaming here, but a vision for Cofactor is to function as a playground of discovery. I think that the science of CWD is just new and fascinating enough. It's replete with its own little absurdities, and it presents the perfect opening for this kind of approach. We have tools and we have the need, and we have this kind of medium. Imagine discovering the solutions to CWD through play. I'm going to put the URL, cofactor.game, on the screen here for a moment, and I just want to acknowledge the help from the Cofactor development team, the alpha testers we've been through. We have an advisory panel that's actually nationwide. It's going to be involved in helping develop this game for adults, educational coordinators locally, and thank you to the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund from the LCCMR in funding this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. Honestly, I find it fascinating, and I'm always impressed every time I hear about it that there are people out there with the skills and smarts like yourself who can actually make something like this and turn it into a reality. So, very impressive. Turning now to our third and final presenter. Of course, the cliche last but certainly not least, and that really does stand here. I just want to introduce Dr. Colin Yoder. He is an assistant professor of food animal education in the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine. After being in private dairy practice for a decade, he came to the University of Minnesota, where he completed an MPH in residency in veterinary public health and preventative medicine. His professional interests are related to epidemiology, preventative medicine, and bringing these tools to veterinarians and farms. So, with that, Colin, it is all yours. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Cory. Appreciate the introduction. Let's make sure we share our screen. Okay. Well, I think Roger really set this up pretty good. We've got some plain talk about CWD strategies for reaching Southeastern Minnesota's Amish communities. So a little bit of background. As many of you probably know, CWD education efforts have really increased. This includes information in the regulation books that the DNR puts out, as well as a lot on their website. Then, of course, there's public health and research groups like MinPro, which all of us have been a part of, and CIDRAP, like we're here with right now, and hunting and conservation groups as well. But the concern would be that minority and underrepresented populations might be getting left out of some of this outreach and education. They might not use or access some of the more mainstream education resources, or they might need something that's more culturally appropriate for them to get access to the information that's out there. And so you might ask, why Amish communities? Well, geographic location is definitely one of the things. What you see on this map is CWD positive deer from 2023. So it's a little old, but it's when we were doing this. And as what you might notice is that there's a lot of blue dots in the southeast corner of Minnesota. And the population that we worked with is located in that green circle, right where a lot of these blue dots are really centered. And we'd also heard about a family that ate a CWD positive deer. Whether that was intentional or not, we don't know. But there's the potential that they aren't getting the information and educational tools that others are getting because they don't use some of the technology that's available. And so, similar to what Roger's study did, we wanted to understand communities' relationships to deer hunting and how much do they know about CWD and what are their concerns, with the goal of being able to make culturally relevant outreach materials, but also connecting with people within the community and leaders. So we did this very similarly, and actually a lot of it was the same as Roger's interview structure. We had semi-structured interviews, but different from Roger's work was our participant recruitment. We had a few key community informants, and we went to them for initial interviews and then use a snowball method where they would tell us other people to talk to. And when those lines of potential participants would lead to a dead end, resorted to some good old-fashioned door knocking. And with that information, we did some thematic analysis, and we found these themes, also very similar to Roger's, but the responses were different from this community. So venison was a motivating reason to hunt. People really like having it as a food source. A third of the people we interviewed identified it as a primary protein source in their house. Food sharing was also common. It might mean trading something processed, like a sausage that they made, but there was also a little bit of an urgency to use whatever deer they had quickly because they used ice houses for freezers as opposed to the electric freezers you or I might have in our house. And so they need to do something with it. And there was also the misconception that cooking the meat would get rid of prions. Recreation, also a huge part of why they hunt. 3/4 of participants said that this was a large part of the reason they go deer hunting. And they felt that the community felt this way as well. It provides vacation time, summer into sport hunting, not unlike other hunters. But they also said that this was a way to connect with nature and enjoy what God has given them in Mother Nature. Despite their heavy involvement with hunting, there was limited knowledge of CWD biology. Only half of people knew it was contagious, and a lot of people self-identified as not having a lot of knowledge. And they'd comment on things like, this is just nature's way to eliminate sickness in the herd. They didn't necessarily view it differently from livestock diseases that they were common with. As far as where they found information, the number one thing we heard was regulation books from the DNR. And that was followed by their local conservation officers. We also had people who used hunting magazines and newspapers. So all of these are probably sources that are giving them good information, but word of mouth was another thing. And so word of mouth, it's only going to be as good as who you heard it from. The thing that we didn't hear from people was that they were using online sources to gather information. So within the community, people just weren't that concerned about it. CWD has been in that part of the state for a long time. And again, they view this as Mother Nature's taking care of itself. Precautions aren't necessarily taken. The comment that we got was, just don't shoot sick-looking deer. That's my precaution. Um, and when they looked at management of CWD overall, people felt that we can't control Mother Nature. We shouldn't even necessarily be trying to control Mother Nature, and that it's not being controlled in other areas. So this map that's up here, also from the time of our studies, you can see in the pink circle, that's where our study participants lived. And you can see Southeast Wisconsin, Northeast Iowa, where there's also CWD, and they didn't necessarily feel like enough was being done there. So why should they worry about it where they were at? The one comment that we really heard a lot from people was that they didn't like the state's use of sharpshooters, and that really kind of turned them off to things that the state was trying to do. So the next question becomes, what did we do with everything we found out? Well, we definitely gained a better understanding of their attitudes and behaviors regarding CWD. And we were also able to um, identify some key contacts within the community and the hunting community and build some relationships with them. So one of the people we talked to was a hunter education instructor. So every young person within that community who's going to take up hunting talked to this guy. Um, we had other community leaders who said, hey, we're involved with this benefit sale that everybody in the community goes to. So we were really able to lean on those relationships later. And then before that, we needed to get some outreach materials that were going to be relevant for them. And so we could actually tailor our outreach materials. And now, because of those relationships we built, we had some distribution means for them. So to be more specific about how we tailored our outreach materials, this is a screenshot from the DNR regulations. And this is where a lot of them said they're going for their information. And as what you can see on the upper right, that's the information they have in there about CWD biology. It's not a lot, but they refer people to the Minnesota DNR website where there is a lot of information. But as I mentioned, we know that these hunters are not going there to get that more information that's available. And so we went back through our MinPro outreach materials and we really tried to tailor it to what are their concerns, what were their questions specifically about CWD. And one of the highlights, things that we did was really important. We still gave them the websites and places to look things up, just in case they wanted to use them. But we tried to give phone numbers for any place that they would need to know. Who can I call if I see a sick deer? Who do I call to get my results back? Some of them were going ahead and eating deer without getting results because they figured they'd get a phone call if there was a problem. So we wanted to give them a place to get the results, but also a time frame that they could expect to have results. And then we also gave them phone numbers for information groups like the DNR, Board of Animal Health, us at MinPro, and then their local conservation officers. And so to kind of try to wrap that up, we hope that this helped set up a framework for others who want to work with minority communities. And by using more qualitative methods, our semi-structured interviews, we got knowledge we would never get out of a standard interview or survey that might be sent out to hunters. For example, I never would have guessed anything about ice houses, and we wouldn't have put it in a survey. So we got insights that we otherwise wouldn't have had that really helped us tailor our outreach materials. And because we went and met with people in person, talked to them, built relationships, we were able to go back and make sure that these outreach materials were actually getting in hands that might actually read them, and places where we knew they'd be received well. So with that, I want to thank a couple of our initial contacts who helped us get in contact with members of the Amish community, Todd Freiberg and Mitch Boyum, and also thank our funding resource, the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And with that, Cory, I'll turn it back to you, and we can field questions.
Love it. Thank you so much to all of you again for I think three great presentations. I joked around with the presenters beforehand that this is one of those rare webinars where it feels like it's there's some optimism involved, and I'm basking in that right now. But yes, happy to take questions. As I said, if you have any, feel free to submit. I know we're somewhat short on time. We have around 7 minutes. But just want to note that if you have any that aren't answered or what you really would like answered, you can always feel free to send us an email afterwards as well, and we can get back to you on that. But we did have one question already posted here, and I think Tom, this is should be somewhat straightforward. But one of the attendees said that they found the cofactor game fascinating. I certainly agree with that, but they were just wondering if Servid Farmer is one of the potential roles that a player could take on with the game.
No, a servant farmer is not a role that you can take on, but you can take on the role of butcher in order to explore economic impacts and some strategies that someone might take in business. So that might be something else that the questioner might be interested in among the roles. The others would be a university scientist, or a if you at one point find yourself in a an Easter egg in the game, you can dream that you've become a deer and become a deer as well. And then also a natural resource manager who would be doing science and communications work. So those are the roles that we have mapped out right now.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to return to Roger. And if all three of you want to put your cameras on too, feel free. If you don't want to, I mean, certainly won't hold it against you. But I wanted to return to Roger and just ask a question. Um, I mean, you'd mentioned, and I know there's always the temptation with, a lot of this stuff to kind of ask, how can we take this and just apply it, in a wide blanket? And I'm guilty of that as well. Like that's always the temptation. I think you sort of addressed that, which was good. But just for, folks on the call who might be, you know, interested in similar work. I guess if you had to tell a state agency that's looking to, improve its relationship with tribal partners or, get more involved in this area, but doesn't necessarily know where to start, I guess, do you have any, recommendations or um, things
Yeah,
that you,
that's a
yeah,
great question and interesting timing. I'm currently working on a project where I'm interviewing both Minnesota DNR natural resource managers as well as tribal natural resource managers to get at that question more deeply. I would say where it starts, in my opinion, is building relationships with one another. So, getting time to be face and face, understand different values and priorities, and understand what's really negotiable and what's not when it comes to thinking about co-management. And I think just being able to understand where each side is coming from is a really good place to start in those conversations. And then, maybe trying to codify what that co-management is going to look like through specifics. Being really specific about what the goal of this project is, making sure that both sides are aligned on that goal and how you're going to move forward together. So, building these partnerships through relationships and then establishing those more formally is my thought.
perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. I guess just more generally, and maybe Colin, if you want to start with this one, I think between the work that you've done and Roger's done, even the work that Tom's doing, I think in my mind, it really shows this value in kind of having, partnerships between obviously state wildlife agencies have a lot of roles and responsibilities, and they're doing, a ton of work on the ground, and there's always, the limitation of resources, et cetera. I guess where do you see, the biggest opportunities for collaboration between, whether it's universities, wildlife agencies, community organizations? Is it, similar to the work that you've done? Is there kind of additional things that you think are needed but may not necessarily be happening because of limited resources? I guess I'd just be curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll start with this. Um, I feel like after building a little bit of a relationship with them and being able to talk with people in the community, that we were able to build some trust. People asked us questions after interviews that we were able to answer and talk through some of their concerns later. And you could really see a difference in how they viewed it from during the interview to after we had a conversation. That they kind of came around and said, "Oh yeah, maybe I should be concerned about that." And groups like the DNR, they can't necessarily go out and have conversations with every group that they can imagine. Um, there's only so many people and so much time, right? Whereas a group like the university that maybe is able to be a little bit more targeted and really focus in on specific groups like Roger's work or like the stuff we did with the Amish community. I think that's an opportunity for us, and we can try to focus in on some of those more niche areas while the DNR is focusing on hunters as a whole.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know if Roger or Tom have anything to add, feel free. Again, I think we have about a minute left, so I hate to cut off Q&A early. I know we have some additional questions in the chat too that I'm tempted to ask, but I might refrain from. So I don't know, any closing thoughts from Tom or Roger on, you know, I guess opportunities moving forward?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody, and this maybe isn't news, but deer don't adhere to political boundaries. It's a problem for everybody, and so I think in every and we have tribal reservation lands in the upper Midwest, but we also have those treaty ceded territories where tribal members retain the rights to hunt, fish, and gather too. And so, really, I see every issue around chronic waste and disease as being relevant to tribes, and I think through treaties they should be engaged. And so, I just want to encourage all the agencies to consider the impacts that they're having on tribal nations as well.
Thanks, Roger. All right. Well, it is one. I hate unless Tom, you want to add anything. Again, I don't know. I'm a little biased, but I'm a fan of role-playing games, so I'll dive into Cofactor. Um,
That's
but yeah, I
fantastic.
don't
No,
know.
I just wanted to add that thank you to CIDRAP for inspiring collaboration through this webinar.
Absolutely happy to do it, and thank you all for joining. Again, I see we have hit our deadline of 1 o'clock. So again, huge thank you to you guys for presenting. I thought it was great. Thank you to everyone who attended. And like I said, this is recorded. As soon as we have it available, we will upload the recording to our website, YouTube channel, so you can watch it back, share it, etc. But without taking up any more of you guys' time, I will leave it at that. So, huge thank you and hope you have a great rest of your week. So, take care.